What's up guys, Ken Okada here, student physical therapist. Let's talk today about cupping. Now cupping recently got a lot of attention, gained a lot of popularity after the 2016 Olympics, when a lot of athletes, particularly swimmers, started to appear with all of these red marks, red circular marks and welts and bruises all over their body, and people started to ask, what the hell are those things? People started to find out those were cupping marks, and all of a sudden everybody wanted to do it. It's basically the kinesio tape of 2016. Now cupping has existed as a form of medicine since the 1500s, and it was used to treat all sorts of conditions. Nowadays, similarly, all sorts of people use it as an alternative form of medicine to treat all sorts of conditions. Now today I'm not going to talk about that perspective of cupping. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about myofascial decompression. Now, myofascial decompression is an application of these cups used as a myofascial intervention. So what is myofascial decompression? Before we go there, I need to explain a couple of things. Let's go to the explain table. Now before we get into what myofascial decompression is, we need to agree on a couple things. Let's go back to our anatomy. When most of us learn anatomy, we learn about the body in regions, which is not a bad thing when we're learning, but as a consequence, we start to think about the body as individual parts. This creates a few problems. From a functional perspective, our body is a cohesive unit that works as a cohesive unit. Breaking it into individual parts just doesn't work in real life. Our body works as a unit to complete functional tasks, and an action in one region of the body will affect things in other parts of the body. When something happens at the bottom, it works its way up the chain. When something happens at the top of the body, it works its way down the chain. Now let's take this a bit further. When we think about our tissues, we think of them as being held together in regions, and that everything is sort of just glued together. If you've ever dissected a cadaver, you kind of know what I mean. Everything is sort of just stuck and stiff. Now, of course, this is not the case in real life or in fresh cadavers. Normal, healthy tissue should slide relatively freely over one another. But when you start to form adhesions and everything starts to not move properly and things start to get tacked down, you start to run into some problems. Now this sliding of tissues is very, very important for normal function. Thomas Myers, who made anatomy trains, demonstrated this very well in his dissection of fresh cadavers. He showed that pulling on fascia of one region of the body didn't just affect that region of the body or the neighboring region or the neighboring region. He showed that pulling on the fascia of one region of the body sort of made the fascia from a very distant region of the body sort of glide and be affected by the action from that other region. That's how healthy tissue usually should work. Now that we got all of that squared away, let's go back to myofascial decompression. Now, myofascial decompression is an application of cupping that was developed by Dr. Chris DiPrato of UCSF. Basically, what you do is you apply the cup to some part of the body, you pump it up so that it lifts the tissue, and then you add movement so that the muscle starts to move underneath that lifted tissue. So what does this do? Let's go back to our explain table. So this is sort of what happens when you apply a cup to the skin. The cup creates a vacuum and sucks the tissue up into the cup. Now when you apply movement, the thought here is that the muscle underneath the skin where you have the cup sort of slides around underneath the cup like so. Now when you apply this to a trigger point or any part of the body that feels restricted or any muscle that has a palpable adhesion, the thought here is, if you think back to what Thomas Myers said, is that these layers sort of start to slide a little bit better. So now I think a fair question to ask here is that actually what's happening? Are you actually creating a vacuum that's sucking up more than just skin and adipose tissue? Are you actually sucking up some of the muscle? The short answer to that question is yes, that is what's happening. Dr. DiPrato has shown in some pilot studies that he's conducting using MRI machines that when you use a cup, it actually lifts multiple layers of tissue, including the muscular layer. Now, I could only provide rough sketches because I absolutely do not have the rights to those MRI images, nor do I actually have them. But I've seen them. I've seen a lecture that was provided by Dr. DePrado himself, and he has shown that this is what happens in MRI studies. Now, what happens when you take off the cup? So the next part of that pilot study was to take off the cup, wait for a period of time, I think it was about 20 or 30 minutes, and take another image of the skin. And what they found was that the layers of tissue that were lifted were still lifted after 20 minutes. And this sort of shows that there's at least some sort of mechanical effect that's happening. There's actual mechanical deformation of the tissues after the application of a cup. So that sort of brings me to the application of myofascial decompression, or the application of cupping as a soft tissue intervention. Currently, I could count all of the research studies on myofascial decompression on one hand. 0. There have been no research studies about this modality, but there's a number of reasons for this. Number 1, funding. Nobody is funding the research. If there's no money, research can't happen. Number 2, the application of cupping is relatively new. As always, research takes time to develop. This is what Dr. DePrado is doing at UCSF. He's performing all of these pilot studies to show that there's something happening underneath the skin after you apply the cups, so that he could convince people to actually let him start studying the effects of this modality. And number 3, we're not looking at cupping as an alternative medicine. There are numerous studies about the evidence behind cupping as an alternative medicine. Now, while the evidence behind cupping is relatively weak, and the quality of all of the studies that have been performed about cupping is relatively questionable, none of the studies actually looked at cupping as a soft tissue intervention in the way or in the context of myofascial decompression. So this sort of brings us to a question that's often asked in these sorts of fields, that how do we reconcile being a doctoral profession and using a modality or an intervention that doesn't have much evidence behind it? That sort of brings us to the grand scheme of manual therapy. The evidence isn't that great. There isn't that much evidence, but what we've seen that it could get people out of pain, at least temporarily. And when pain is the limiting factor in someone's function, when pain is what's causing their dysfunctional movement, getting them out of pain, at least temporarily, so that we could start to restore their normal movement patterns is very important. So I guess the important thing to keep in mind here is that this is an adjunct to therapy. This is not the end-all be-all. This is not something that should replace all other interventions or all other therapy. This is simply something that you do in addition to exercise. This is something that you do in addition to neuromuscular re-education. This is not going to solve all of your problems, but it could help. So hopefully that answers some of the questions that you might have had about cupping or myofascial decompression. Check out Dr. DePrado's stuff. He's doing some great things for this field. Check out Thomas Myers of Anatomy Train's great perspective about how the human body works. If you have any other questions or anything else that you want to explain, drop a comment below. Remember to subscribe. See you in the next one.